Thank you very much, Tom, and good evening. I want to thank all of you for being here. I don't know if tonight is as exciting for you as it is for me, but a few minutes ago, Jim Warren and I were talking about this. There was a time when Republicans in Arizona, in the day of Barry Goldwater, it was said, could meet in a phone booth. And tonight, Darcy told us there are more than 1,000 of you here. Thank you so much. For those of you who, like me, believe that the fight for freedom is the single most important human endeavor in this nation and for the world, you have to be proud of all that has been accomplished by the Goldwater Institute. And every one of you deserves to give yourselves a huge round of applause for what we've been able to do. Having been there when a small group of us conceived the highest rank in scouting and become an Eagle Scout, and you probably don't also know that to this very day, he remains involved in the Boy Scouts of America. You probably also don't know that on a high school trip to Washington, D.C. as a part of Boys Nation, he met President Ronald Reagan and who became his inspiration and his role model. Prior to being elected governor, our speaker served in the Wisconsin State Assembly and authored very important pieces of legislation, including truth in sentencing laws and photo identification requirements for voters, a cause that I am deeply proud about and think is extremely important. In 2002, he was elected Milwaukee County Executive to reform their scandal-ridden county government. He cut the county's debt by 30%. He reduced the county workforce by 25%. And he authored 9 consecutive budgets without increasing the property tax once. He took office as governor last January, promising to create an environment in which private businesses could grow and create jobs, pass an honestly balanced budget, and protect Wisconsin taxpayers. He knew that government had grown too big, too fast. Wisconsin government had repeatedly increased taxes, avoided the tough decisions, and passed the buck to the next generation. Our speaker knew that standing up to the status quo and putting power back in the hands of people and taxpayers wouldn't be easy, but he had the courage to do it. He knew that the state needed real reform, and he was willing to put the next election behind the importance of the next generation. As the invitation to tonight's dinner indicates, our speaker is no stranger to controversy. Just 2 months into office, and I'm glad this didn't happen to me, he faced fleeing legislators, belligerent protests, harsh criticism by President Obama, and public employee unions. In the face of this firestorm and intense national media fervor, he maintained his cool, and he maintained his principled stand and refused to blink. Describing his fight with organized labor to control Wisconsin's out-of-control government spending, George Will wrote that our speaker has refuted the left's sustaining conviction that a leftward-clicking ratchet guarantees that liberalism's advances are irreversible. Syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer has called him a part of a new generation of Republicans who has looked at the debt and is crossing the Rubicon. Indeed, Krauthammer wrote that our guest speaker is recklessly principled, a description that I would be very proud of, and that he is putting the question to the nation of, are we a serious people? In 16 years in the United States Congress, I learned that the single most lacking character trait in Washington, D.C. is courage. The courage to do the right thing in the face of intense opposition and criticism. Our keynote speaker tonight has demonstrated he has that kind of courage. Please join me in welcoming Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker.
Thank you. Thank you. Boy, Congressman, after an introduction like that, I should take the cue and say thank you all for being here. It's been a great night. And head home. I don't know how you get much better than that. And it is indeed an honor considering your distinguished career, and it's an honor to be here tonight with all of you. Tonette and I had the great thrill of dining this evening with another great hero, not only here in Arizona, but across America, former Vice President Dan Quayle. Appreciate you being here as well. And I appreciate all of you. I talked to a number of legislators on the way in and other elected officials. Appreciate your courage and principle standing up with all of us here this evening. And just a remarkable crowd. Now, as our two nephews, one of our nephews is married, and most impressive for us tomorrow morning, we're going to see our grandnephew, who's just under 2 years old, so that's always exciting. During the thick of all this, when I was on the Sunday morning TV shows a lot, we tend to spend a fair amount of time connecting with them on Skype. And so every time I'd be on Skype with JoJo, we blow kisses to him. And the cutest thing, my nephew and his wife said that one of those days when I was on Meet the Press, every time I'd come up on TV, he would walk up and kiss the TV set. And then he'd wonder when David Gregory came in why I wasn't there anymore. I often wonder that too. But that's a whole nother matter. And so for our family, on Tonette's side of the family, the other great thing is they're back in Wisconsin now, but both of my beautiful nieces, who are now 4 and 7, were born here in Phoenix. So some great ties to this community and to this great state. You've got a number of great leaders, and it's an honor to be here tonight. It's also, as was mentioned in the introduction, for me, it's the perfect doubleheader. And I'm not talking about the Brewers and what happened this year, because they didn't make it to the World Series, so I won't even go there, but rather to talk about how to be here tonight with an institution named after the great Senator Goldwater. And then tomorrow, Tonette and I take off to California to speak at the Reagan Ranch. It doesn't get much better than that for someone who is really drawn not only to being a conservative and Republican, but to the wonders of public service through limited government by those two great giants. It is an honor to be here tonight, and again tomorrow, heading off to the Reagan Ranch. So it is a thrill. I get asked quite frequently, Governor, how's it going in Wisconsin? And for a while there, I talk a lot about sports. Thankfully, I can still talk about the Packers. The Badgers have kind of given up on their ability to go for a national championship, and the Brewers didn't make it past the Cardinals, but the Packers are still in pretty good shape. But most people are asking more than just sports. They're asking about what's happening in Wisconsin. And I'm going to spend a few minutes tonight filling you in on that, but I want to begin by the context in which we began this year. You see, I thought it was interesting when George Will was up there talking about the U.S. Constitution, and I'm going to touch that in a second as well. But early on this year, on January 3rd to be exact, when I took the oath of office as the 45th governor of the state of Wisconsin, we did something a little unconventional, and we've continued to do unconventional things in our state, but we started out by moving the swearing-in ceremony from the East Wing, where there's a bust of Robert La Follette, who is an icon to some in the state of Wisconsin, one of the leaders of the so-called progressive movement. We moved it around the corner to where the state constitution is encased. The reason I did that, a lot of people in Wisconsin, even those sometimes in office, don't fully recognize or understand this, but is I wanted to start things out right on that first day. And so I moved where I took the oath of office and where I gave my inaugural address right in front of the Constitution that was approved in the spring of 1848. Had to be brought up twice, and finally was approved. And one of the great things that even some folks of history don't understand in our state, there's a clause in there called the Frugality Clause. It's never been amended, never been altered. A lot of things in state constitutions get brought up for changes. This was the only section that's never been touched. And it talks about how frugality in government brings freedom and prosperity for our people. I didn't know how prophetic I would be that later this year that would prove to be true. It's worth repeating. Frugality in government brings freedom and prosperity for our people. That's how we charted out our course. It wasn't just about a specific bill, piece of legislation, an administrative rule change. It was about saying those are our guiding principles. Those are the things that weren't a part of just my campaign or my pledge or some sort of party manifesto, but rather those were the words of our ancestors who saw fit in the spring of 1848 to say, we want to be a part of the United States, we want to be a state, and this is how we define the future of our great Wisconsin. And so that's how we charted our course out. Now, the great news is not only did we take on the challenges of budget repair bill, where we made significant changes in terms of how we deal and interact with public employees in the state of Wisconsin, we started even before that. On that very first day, one of the first two things I did was, number one, I walked back to my office and brought the Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin in, someone who for years had been somewhat lonely because he was the only Republican in statewide office across from a very liberal Democrat. But I gave him a letter on that first day that said, you are now authorized and required to join the federal lawsuit challenging the president's unconstitutional health care act. And we said Wisconsin's going to be a part of that. And then we called the members of the State Assembly and the State Senate leadership in, and we said, here's the call for a special session. Said we knew in our state, when I campaigned, when I applied to be the CEO of our state government over about a year and a half in that what I call a job interview, I told the people of our state we faced an economic and a fiscal crisis. And like any CEO taking over any business in our state or in our country, if you're serious about taking on that challenge, you don't wait a year or 6 months or even a month, you take it on right away. So I called them in a special session on the first day we took the oath of office. And I said the best way to get the economy going again, the best way to face our economic crisis in our state is to get government out of the way. So we lowered the tax burden on job creators, which is kind of prophetic. I think tomorrow we're going to be at the Reagan Ranch again on Saturday. We're going to be at the spot where back 30 years ago in the fall of 1981, President Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Act that was about lowering the tax burden through the leadership of people like Jack Kemp and Bill Roth, and others in the Congress then reinforced that. But I think back to the impact that that had back a generation ago. You know, through the end of President Reagan's tenure, 15 million new jobs by putting more money back not in the hand. On top of that, we've changed the business climate in our state so that job creators really want to invest and put people to work. See, every year our statewide Chamber of Commerce does a survey, random survey of different CEOs, big, small, and everywhere in between in our state. They found a year ago when they did that survey and they asked what employers thought, 10%, just 10% of our employers thought Wisconsin was heading the right direction. This year, several months after our reforms were enacted, you know what that number went from? It went from 10% to 88% who say Wisconsin's heading in the right direction. And a solid majority say in the next 12 months they're going to add more jobs because, again, they have confidence in our state. The other thing that we had an impact on was not only employers in our state, but CEOs from across the country. You know, there are all sorts of rankings out there. One of them I like to watch every year is one that Chief Executive magazine does. They do 500 randomly selected CEOs from across America. In our state, we don't historically talk about that a whole lot because usually we've been ranked somewhere between 40 and 50. 2 years ago, we were 43. Last year, we were 41. This year, again, several months into our reforms after they were enacted, and the Republicans and even some of the discerning Democrats in the legislature voted with us, when people took note of what we were doing, both economically and then later what we did to reform our budget process and put the power back in the hands of the people, we went from 41 to 24, up 17 spots, the fastest increase of any state in the entire country. And I went back and asked the publisher of that Chief Executive magazine. They said it's actually the fastest increase in any 1 year of the United States. And it fits actually very well with my friend, last year's speaker, Chris Christie. You see, back in February, every year the National Governors Association invites all the governors to Washington. And the president invites, regardless of party, Democrat and Republican guys enough, come over for a dinner, and then they have a lunch the next day. Well, you can imagine I had 14 state senators outside of the state of Wisconsin hanging out in Illinois who didn't want to come in and do their job, which, by the way, one of my members of Congress gave me a great bumper sticker after that was concluded that said, "One walker beats 14 runners." But as they were all hanging out in Illinois, I didn't think it was very good for me to go to Washington. So I stayed in our state's capital. And after lunch that day there at the White House, Chris gave me a call and he said, "Wow, Walker, you won't believe this. The president just ripped you and me in front of all the other governors." And I said, "Well, what did he say?" And so he told me. So that night, every night, some of you probably followed, we used to do 5 o'clock press conferences live because I was tired of the filter of the media. So I would go on air at 5 o'clock. And after a while, first it was our local TV in the state, then eventually some of the cable networks picked it up. But I wanted to talk directly to my people. I said, I don't want to filter. I want to tell people exactly what's going on so they can see it and hear it themselves. But on that particular night, I have great reverence for the office of the president. Even if I don't agree with the president, I respect the office. And so I didn't take a cheap shot at him, but I said, you know, I heard that someone asked me, they said, well, did you hear about what the president said today about, you know, why it's unfair that you and Governor Christie are attacking public employees? I said, well, that's interesting, because I am sure that the President of the United States knows that federal employees do not have collective bargaining for wages and benefits. I'm sure he must know that. And I'm sure that the President of the United States knows that federal government employees on average pay 28% for their health insurance premium, which is twice what I'm asking for from state and local employees in Wisconsin. Because I'm sure the President of the United States would not be getting his facts from the big government union bosses instead of checking out what the true facts are, and I'm sure he made a mistake in what he said about Wisconsin. That was the last time we heard the governor or the President of the United States talking about what's going on in Wisconsin. You see, as I said last week, when a couple dozen Occupy Chicago folks showed up at a speech I gave in downtown Chicago, you can yell all you want, but the facts are the facts, and the facts show that the reforms are working in the state of Wisconsin. There's just no doubt about it. You look across the board. We took a $3.6 billion budget deficit, one of the largest structural deficits in state history, and in this budget made fundamental changes that now end the budget year, the biennium, with a $300 million surplus. We did it. We did it unlike nearly every other state across the country. You see, in more than 40 states, with governors who are both Democrat and Republican alike, more than 40 states face budget deficits this year. And many of those governors, Democrat and Republican alike, cut billions of dollars from aid to local governments, school districts, university systems, and otherwise. And we said in Wisconsin we were going to do it differently. You see, the largest single factor in our state budget is aid to local government. The largest percentage of that is aids to our public schools. And we said, unlike those other states where they just made cuts, we weren't going to make the cuts and then pass them on either to the taxpayers or to gutting some of the core services that all of us as local residents wanted. We said, no, there's a simpler, better way to protect middle-class jobs and to protect Wisconsin property taxpayers. And the way, not only did we make that change, but we changed things that most people on the Main Street media, at least nationally, don't talk about. We not just in their health insurance coverage by renegotiating their benefits because we opened the marketplace up. Imagine what the free market can do everywhere else across America. It can make a fundamental change. What we've seen is, despite all the rhetoric, in places like Kaukauna, which is just down the way from Appleton, Kaukauna was a school district where they took a $400,000 deficit and turned it into a more than $1.5 million surplus. They used that money to hire more teachers in the elementary ages, to lower the classroom size. But what I like most of all, they set aside $300,000 to start paying their teachers based on merit. You see, we have examples like that all across the state. In fact, today there was a report that some tried to twist into saying, well, you know, some of these districts had to lay off teachers. Well, they did. 3 of our biggest ones, Milwaukee, Janesville, and Kenosha, had to lay off teachers. Why? Because they rushed to ram through contracts before our law went into effect. Despite the warnings, despite all the things that we point out to them, they did that. They are the ones who are failing because of that. But across the rest of the state, what we found, we pointed out today, just literally hours ago, as new data came out from our Department of Public Instruction, which is run by an independent, unaffiliated to me, superintendent of public schools, we pointed out that the difference between the number of new teacher hires in our state versus layoffs or non-renewals was a net increase of over 1,200. Over 1,200. Not because we mandated it, but because we gave our schools the local control to be able to choose what they do. Now, in our budget, I love the video up here because I lifted the cap on school choice. I was one of the authors of that back in the 90s as the first and hopefully most successful school choice program in the country. We no longer have any cap on low income, and we actually included the middle class in the state of Wisconsin as well. Because we said every child, no matter what zip code they live in, should have access to a great education. And for us now, the great news is it's not just at our choice schools or our private school systems, it's in our charter schools and our virtual schools. And as we give more of those tools to our traditional public schools, like the one where Tonette and I have 2 sons in Wauwatosa, they can operate the same ways that the ones that are successful in the private sector and the charters are doing as well, because we're giving our schools and school administrators and local school boards the tools to do what is right. In the end, what I like more than anything is not just the budget savings or the better business environment that will create more jobs in the private sector. And John, you were right in that introduction. I constantly have to point that out to the press, that my pledge last year running for governor was not to create 250,000 jobs. It was to create an environment where the people of Wisconsin, not the government, create 250,000 jobs. The best thing, though, is not the business environment. It's not the budgetary savings. It's not the fact that for the next 2 Decembers, we're going to essentially have a property tax freeze in the state of Wisconsin. The most exciting thing for the future of our state, and maybe if it ripples elsewhere, the future of our country, is that now in Wisconsin, we can put the best and the brightest in our classrooms and in government positions, because now school boards and local governments and state government can actually make staffing decisions based on merit, based upon who are the right people to put in those positions. They can set money aside to pay based on performance, just like my friend Mitch Daniels did in Indiana 6 or 7 years ago when they changed collective bargaining just for state employees. And now today, some of the greatest reward receivers are those individuals who perform, who excel, who do great work in state government. We can do it in all levels of government now. That means in the end, not just today, but for my kids and my grandkids' generation, they're going to have a government that's limited and focuses in on the things we do expect out of the government. But more importantly, we're going to have a government that operates like the will of the people, that actually performs like you do in the private sector. I said for years, I am sick of the false choice in government between either raising taxes or cutting services. Nobody in the private sector satisfies themselves with those 2 ridiculous choices. You don't double the price of your product or cut in half your quality, or people run to your competitor. Yet that's the false choice we're always given in politics, and you as the taxpayers and the voters are told that's the only choice out there. Well, it's not. In business, you balance the 2 out. You use lean manufacturing or Lean Six Sigma or other quality management tools to say, you know what? We're going to get more out of our employees. We're going to do things more efficiently and more effectively, and you keep your costs in check with where your customers can be, and you still provide exceptional quality to keep your customer base. We should be doing it in the limited areas where it makes sense in government. Because of the reforms and collective bargaining, we can ultimately do that, not just now, not just next year, but for generations to come. Now, the interesting thing in saying, you say, well, that's great. You're doing all these wonderful things. Why is it that they're trying to recall you in Wisconsin starting next week? Well, let me let you in on a little secret. In fact, there's a lot of people traveling right now, although there were a few out here before. I said I'm pretty used to people being bussed in from other states to protest me. I saw a lot of that this spring. I see it about every stop I make. I was in New York once back late spring, and Paul Ryan and I sometimes trade off guest hosting on Squawk Box, and one day I was in New Jersey where it's at, and I came across the river to Manhattan, jumped out of the SUV I was in with the workers under the bus all throughout this debate. What they didn't like about what we did in Wisconsin was we said, you know what? If you want a right to choose act, we got the right to choose act. What we said is, if you're a public employee, if you're one of our great 300,000 plus public servants, and I really believe that, there are 300,000 people in my state who work in the state and the local level of government. The vast, vast majority of people I know are tremendously dedicated to serving the public, which is precisely why I said, you know what? You no longer by law have to be forced to be a part of a union, and in fact, your paycheck can no longer have those dues deducted. That's what this is all about. They want their hands on the automatic dues. That's what this battle is about. It's not about workers' rights. It's not about anything else. The facts need to be out on the table. So let me just end by saying this, and then I understand they want to have me take a couple questions here. It was interesting, and I was thinking about this as George Will, who I'm a great fan of, was talking at the beginning about the Constitution. I referenced my Constitution in Wisconsin. But about a month or so ago, Tonette and I, back in the middle of September, had a chance to go to Philadelphia as part of a Governor's Association trip. And a lot of times when we're in places like that, we like to get up really early and sneak out before the agenda starts. And so we went over to Constitution Hall, saw the Liberty Bell, and then stood inside Constitution Hall itself. And it's so amazing to be in there. Most, if probably, if not all of you have been there or places like that. But you just kind of take it all in. And you look up at the chair with the half-rising sun, and you see where General Washington, later President Washington, was at. And you think about all the tremendous people that were in and out of that structure, and you think of the Declaration of Independence, and then you think, as we did a few weeks later, about the Constitution and some more than 2 centuries that have gone by since that group gathered in Philadelphia to approve that in the middle of September. And I think to myself, as a kid, I loved history. But sometimes I thought of those founders as almost bigger than life. You know, sometimes it puts you so far out of touch from thinking how remarkable, and they were exceptional leaders. But it dawned on me, you know, one of the great things about visiting there and reinforcing that is, you know, their call to starting out our great exceptional country that we call the United States of America wasn't something to just do and then be pushed to the side. It's something we are called to renew each and every day that we're a part as a citizen of this great country. And early on in this debate, I used to thought it was a little bit too melodramatic, but to me, what we're doing, not just in Wisconsin, but what I hope others will be called to do all across America. State houses from here to Madison, from Columbus to Indianapolis to just about anywhere across America, and particularly, John, as you point out, in the halls of Congress, where courage is a commodity in scarce demand. The reality is, what made our country great, and I believe will continue to make our country great, is in times of crisis, be it fiscal, economic, military, social, you name it. In times of crisis, just like that group that gathered in Philadelphia more than 2 centuries ago, in times of crisis, we've had men and women of courage who thought more about the future of their children and their grandchildren than they thought about their own political careers. We need to have leaders at this moment who think more about the next generation than they do about the next election. We need to have leaders and we then need to have people like all of you gathered here tonight, who not just in Wisconsin, but in Arizona and every other state across this great country, who when leaders do what they said they were going to do in the election, stand up and make those tough choices. We saw it in Wisconsin with my lawmakers, not just with me, but with our lawmakers, make decisions that aren't just politically courageous, but in many cases were physically courageous votes to take and continue to be so today. We need to make sure that there are freedom-loving Americans all across this country who are willing to stand up shoulder to shoulder and arm to arm and say, we're not going to back down. We're going to continue to make good decisions for the future of the next generation, because that's what the founders of this country built this country on, and that's what the great leaders through the more than 2 centuries that we've been this exceptional in the United States have done, and I believe will continue to do in the future. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. Thank you. And I think, I'm looking through the light, so I think I've got the right spot to go with the microphone. Go ahead with the first question. You got it?
It's a pleasure to meet you tonight, Governor Walker. Hey, it's impressive what you've accomplished in Wisconsin, and I got to tell you, I wish you were in the Congressional Super Committee, because they have a heck of a lot to accomplish right now. And that thought in mind, taking what you've accomplished in your state, what recommendations would you provide to that committee to try to meet the needs of what we need as a country right now? in the immediate balancing of the federal budget?
Well, at the risk of going beyond my scope, because I say I got my hands full as governor of Wisconsin, but I look even beyond the super committee and I think one of the great challenges we have in the federal government is we have a federal government that has grown way beyond what that group talked about in Philadelphia back in that mid-September 224 years ago. And we need to get refocused on that. And I mean, obviously, as a governor, I think a lot about the 10th Amendment. Although I remind fellow governors and state lawmakers that the 10th Amendment doesn't just say those rights not defined in the Constitution as inherently the rights or of the responsibility of the federal government are not only inherently the rights of the state, but more importantly, of the people. Of the people. Because that's where I think the breakdown in the federal government is people forgot about. I mean, it's just about amassing power. And so I think it's more than just saying who's going to get a haircut in all of this and what are the changes going to be. We've got to go back to the larger context of saying what is the role of the federal government and beyond, what is the role of government in our lives and where do we want to go as a country? I, for one, think the role of the government at both the state, the federal, and even at the local needs to be fairly well limited and defined, and we shouldn't be creeping beyond that. I mean, I look at things, simple things, even just simple as saying, why is the federal government involved in things like Medicaid that pick winners and losers? Give us a block grant. Let us make decisions at the state level. Let us make decisions that ultimately, not only at the state level, but empower decisions to be made not based on a fee-for-service basis, but instead say, let the market drive that. Let decisions be more about outcomes that individuals demand, not what the government sets up through some sort of pseudo-bureaucratic system out there. I mean, I think the more we get back to those founding principles, the easier it is. The more you get stuck in the minutia of saying, well, if we move this here, we move that there, I just think that's long-term a recipe for disaster. We need to make big, fundamental, permanent structural change. It's why we did what we did in Wisconsin. One other side, forgive me for going on this, but I mentioned Meet the Press. It was interesting. One of the days I was on Meet the Press, a day or two before, two of my state union leaders had said, we'll take the 5 and the 12%, just don't get rid of collective bargaining. So David Gregory asked me 3 times on that show why I wouldn't concede to what I asked for. 3 times I had to remind him I used to be a county official and that I knew firsthand that no statewide union leader could make a contract deal with me or any other local jurisdiction in the state of Wisconsin. I got 1,700 municipalities, 424 school districts, 72 counties. No statewide leader can negotiate a contract on the local level. And so I said that's a bogus argument, not to mention that those who had been, for one, I still think enough of voters that I think the voters can handle that if we're honest about what the choices are on the table. Sure.
Governor, I'm a native of Wisconsin myself, and those of you that have never been to Wisconsin, outside of Arizona, Wisconsin is probably the second prettiest state in the United States. Being a native, I talked to a couple folks today, and they said the easiest way for you to avoid a recall was to figure out a way to keep Prince Fielder in with the Brewers. So that's one question. But second question is, I am in the media, and how do you talk about David Gregory, how do you feel you've been portrayed by the national media? You've been on the spotlight really from day one since your term began, and do you feel gotcha media is a big part of some of the problems that have gone on with the coverage?
Sure. Yes. The simple answer to that, is it a part of it? Yeah, but as any of us conservatives in public life know, we can't complain about the media because that'll just make you crazy after a while because it's going to happen. You just got to find other ways of getting the facts. And the good news is increasingly more and more people, particularly young people, aren't relying on traditional media sources to get their news. And so we've got to find more ways to reach out and get that message out. And the more we do that, the better off we're going to be. I'll give you one good example. I don't mean to pick on one network, but a month ago I was on, NBC had a thing called Education Nation, where they had 10 governors, split of both Democrat and Republicans. Brian Williams was the moderator. 10 governors for like an hour and 20 minutes, I think it was. The first 20 minutes was Brian Williams and I debating. And the irony of all right, it's all right, I can handle that. I've handled it before, so I can handle it now. But the irony was, we literally joked about this in our office before we went to that session in New York City, because someone wrote a letter to the editor, or an open letter to Brian Williams that was printed in a weekly tabloid on the campus of the University of Wisconsin called the Isthmus, that is about left of Pravda. And it was an open letter questioning how a guy like me could be on an education panel. And the irony was, we said, you know, what a joke. Can you even imagine the idea that a national media anchor would use an unsubstantiated open letter to the editor in a weekly tabloid on a university campus? And you know what the first 10 to 15 minutes of questioning were? It was reading this letter, saying, why do you call teachers union thugs? To which I said to Brian, everything I do is on YouTube. If I go to McDonald's and order a burger, it's on YouTube. Everything I talk about, someone's recording. I said, I defy you to go and look in the past year, since the beginning of this year I've been governor. You cannot find one time where I've said anything publicly about teachers where I haven't sang their praises, where I haven't talked about the exceptional teachers who teach my two sons, a junior and senior at Wauwatosa East High School. I talk about that all the time. I said, you'll never hear that. Well, he literally asked me.
Your tenacity and your courage.
Next.
Tremendous. You know, given the challenges like we see in Ohio with Governor Kasich and all the other attacks you had to deal with, personal and the media and the constant challenges you dealt with personally, do you think there's any way you can ever get past the thugs, the union leaders, the liberal press, to take the message that you have that is so logical and fair to the American worker, the union guy, to try to get them to understand the message and make the decisions for themselves, instead of just following these guys that lead them down the wrong path?
Went back to school and they go, hey, my schools are the same or better. And in December, when people see that their property tax bills essentially in most parts of the state are the same or lower, I think people go, I don't care what attack ads you show me. The truth is, things are working. Which goes to your second point. I'm convinced that that's what, particularly the next 2 months, as they're circulating recall petitions, but thereafter, if we have a campaign in Wisconsin, it'll ultimately be our chance in Wisconsin, but I think the nation will watch to tell that story. One of the things I'm always amazed, and I was up in Marinette, which is up in the far northeast portion of our state, a week and a half ago, at a company that's almost entirely union, private sector union. And one of the first questions, I took questions. Sometimes I'm a masochist. I go to schools and take questions too. But I took questions from all the guys who were there from the union. And the first guy up says, why would you, a union-busting, anti-worker, anti-union guy, be at this plant? And I said, well, I took the mic and walked out right to him. Didn't get threatening. I just had a nice him and I conversation. I said, well, that's a great question. A lot of people ask me that. I said, what I'm doing is one of the most pro-worker things you can do. See, I'm not doing anything with the private sector. That's a whole other debate, a whole other discussion. But for public employees, there's two things I'm doing that are much, much more pro-worker than anything that's been done before. I'll give you a good example of this vividly. A year ago, long before I was governor, there's a young woman in one of the Milwaukee Public Schools, who was named the Outstanding New Teacher of the Year by the English Teachers Council in Wisconsin. Phenomenal teacher. A week later, she got a pink slip. Why? Because even before I was governor, the Democrats in charge before cut money from public education. They just gave the schools no tools. So they had to lay off teachers. Now, she was named the Outstanding New Teacher of the Year in the entire state, and she was one of the first ones to get booted. Why? Collective bargaining says, last in, first out. So I said, who can tell me with a straight face that makes any sense, not just to the general public, but to fellow workers, fellow teachers, So we tell stories like that and say, what we did is say, if you're an exceptional teacher, you're going to be protected. In fact, one of the great things I saw back in August when teachers were starting to come back to school, they'd come up to Tonette and I and say, thank you. I'd be like, you're a teacher and you said, thank you? That's great. I said, thank you. I'm back at school now and it's finally filled with people who want to be there, with people who want to do great things for our kids, with people who haven't retired 2 or 3 years ago but still show up to work. I'm at a school now where everyone wants to be there. That's what we're doing for public employees, be it in schools or cities or towns or counties or state government. We're empowering people to do what they want to do, which is more often than not to serve the public, to be professionals, to do a great job. We're empowering to do that, and then eventually we're going to set aside performance and merit standards so that those exceptional employees that save money, that perform better, that find new efficiencies can be rewarded for that as well. And finally, the biggest thing, and again, it goes back to some of these teachers in Milwaukee, some of our public teachers are paying something like $1,400 a year between the state and the local teachers union dues. And so in the end, they're actually, David Letterman said this one of the times in the thick of all this. I was on the top 10 list, and he said, you know you're a public employee, and one of the top 10 was, if you pay more for union dues than you pay for health insurance coverage. Well, that's one of the things we changed. Now our public employees, they can choose to do that, but they don't have to. So if they want to spend it on premiums or their kids' college education or whatever, they can do all that. So I think the more we're able to get that message out and say, there's a difference between being pro-union leader boss versus pro-worker. And I think that's a great message, again, not just in Wisconsin, but I think all across America. So if nothing else, my father once said, my father's a longtime retired minister, and once a minister friend of his was asked, why do you preach to the choir? Tonight you might say I'm preaching to the choir with a bunch of fellow conservatives, but well, I guess the last request I'd tell you on that point is the friend that my dad had said, well, I preach to the choir because I want the choir to sing. So tonight, I'm asking you to sing. If you believe in what we're talking about, tell the message in Arizona and all across America that we can do things better, but we don't have to do it always with more government. God bless you. Thanks for having us out.